So thinking about a simplified approach and what this might look like. Usually such approaches, as more or less suggested by Bridgman and Davis, differentiate between agenda setting, policy formulation, decision-making, implementation and evaluation in a conventional chronology. It is nevertheless a simplified and ideal type of model of the policy process. Under real-world conditions, policy processes rarely feature such clear-cut beginnings and endings. At the same time, policies are continually reviewed, fiddled with, reformulated and sometimes terminated. These processes do not occur in the clear-cut manner the model suggests. Instead, the stages are constantly meshed and tangled. Moreover, the model almost suggests, if one wasn't to read the associated text, that policy operates in a vacuum. Nothing could be further from the truth, as they are developed and adopted in a crowded, contested policy space that itself leaves little space for innovation. So new policies develop in a dense environment of already existing policies, in which earlier policies form a central part of the adoption and managing of a particular measure. Frequently, other policies act as the key obstacles to the adoption and implementation of a particular measure. So a key hint for your final assignment: any policy proposal that you come up with has to be scanned against the existing policy field. Is it congruent? Is it contradictory? Even if we don't take the linearity of the policy cycle model too seriously, it nevertheless provides us with a framework to think up the separate functions and processes that inevitably form part of any policy process. Here we will deal with them fairly superficially, but in more depth in later weeks. So let's talk a bit more about what a simplified model might look like. Attempts to understand the policy-making process have identified at least 3 different phases: agenda setting, decision-making, and implementation. Variations of this model can be found in virtually any textbook of public policy. I've referred to Alan Fenner's text on Australian public policy to discuss these. It's also helpful to consider that each of these phases usually has its own locus or realm of activity. Agenda setting usually occurs at the boundary between society and government. Policy formulation takes place within the executive and legislative institutions of government, and policy implementation takes place within the administrative institutions of government. Each phase raises a number of questions. Alan Fenner identifies these as core questions raised in the agenda setting phase. You may wish to keep these in mind as we continue. Which social problems, defined how and what solutions are explored, and what's the level of priority? So thinking about agenda setting, problem solving and issue selection, policy making presupposes the recognition of a policy problem. Problem recognition requires that what is perhaps a problem for the few becomes a problem for the many. It needs to become a social problem, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. You might like to take a moment to think of some examples of social problems that require policy intervention and just jot these down. The next step is actually getting it on the agenda. Numerous studies since the 1960s have shown that problem recognition and agenda setting are inherently political processes. Actors within and outside government constantly seek to influence and collectively shape the agenda, for example by taking advantage of rising attention to a particular issue, dramatising a particular problem. For example, media releases and newspaper editorials have more impact and are more likely to be published when they're about something topical. Policy players outside government are aware of this, and it forms part of the rules of the game of policy making. The crucial step here is to move an issue from its recognition, frequently expressed by interest groups and affected parties, up to the formal political agenda. Research suggests that the nature of the problem is not as influential as a plausible image. The example of climate change is a good illustration of where governments are confronted with forced choice situations, where they simply cannot ignore public sentiment and without risking the loss of legitimacy or credibility. Another example of how long it can take for an issue to become a problem for policy purposes is that of providing income support for single parents. This did not happen until the 1970s, and when it was finally introduced, it was for women and not for men. During the second stage of the policy cycle, so policy formulation and decision-making, policy issues are expressed as problems, and proposals and demands are transformed into government programs. The sorts of questions raised include: what solutions are considered? How widely, openly and genuinely does the government consult? What interests are given access? What institutional factors intrude? Which department or area of government is given responsibility? The ministerial staff and the top bureaucrats are crucial in policy formulation. Nevertheless, numerous studies show that processes early in the formulation stage emanating from outside the bureaucracy can be quite influential in terms of the final outcome, at least as much as the formal parliamentary processes through which policy travels. Influence wielding is often contrasted between two types, differing on the extent to which they are permeable to outside interests. The iron triangles is one, and policy networks is another. Once an issue is on the political agenda, the next step concerns the sort of decision-making processes that takes place. If you recall a discussion of pluralism and elite theories, and also thinking about public choice theory, federalism, incrementalism, or the notion of muddling through, you may wish to consider these alongside the elements of the model. So we've just talked about policy formulation, and the final phase is implementation. The questions that this phase raises include: how is the policy coordinated with other related policies? What resources are committed? Is the effectiveness of the policy evaluated? What actions are taken to amend the policy in application? Ideally, implementation has the following components: specification of program details, allocation of resources, and operational decisions. The link between policy formulation and action can be distant. Policy intent does not necessarily translate into action, and when it does translate into action, it may not necessarily be in the manner initially envisaged or intended. Policy may thus be remade in the process of implementation. Initially, implementation studies assumed hierarchies and top-down processes. In 1980, this approach was turned on its head by the street-level approach of Michael Lipsky. Today's lecture should have helped you to better understand the complex matrix of policy, politics, and administration that is policy making, when, for example, electoral considerations, budget constraints, and implementation problems all pull in competing directions. Problems might be open to multiple solutions or to none at all. My concluding comment: policy making is messy and complex, but we can employ some tools to help us to make sense of the policy process. The policy cycle is one of these. Another is acknowledgement of the rules of the game, and another is the idea of street-level bureaucrats. These are just some. There are others that we will continue to explore in the course. Just to recap the main points. The idea of a policy cycle is just that. It's an idea that tries to help us make sense of the complex and messy world of policy making. There is no standard process, but there are rules of the game. Our success will depend greatly on our appreciation of this. A simplified approach is a good place to begin, so thinking about agenda setting, policy formulation, and implementation. We also introduced the notion of street-level bureaucrat, which challenges the idea that policy is a top-down and a hierarchical process.